Okay, thank you. So in terms of RCRA, I know the hazardous waste regulations, the goal of most remedial project managers is to not have any interaction with RCRA or people who work in RCRA. So generally, they don't make eye contact with me. However, I wanted to talk about those cases where we do have to, where you do have to consider RCRA regulations, and it's much better to plan ahead of time than to get into a situation where RCRA requirements are applicable and you may have some problems. So there is obviously a state and federal RCRA, just like remediation programs. And the rules in terms of what's hazardous and exactly how it can be managed can vary from state to state. But a lot of the regulations are very, very similar in the northeastern states. So you have your hazardous waste regulations, and then you also have, in different states, you will have solid waste regulations. And I'm also in charge of the solid waste program, so let me just plug for that. That say if you had asbestos in your waste or some special oily waste that may not meet the definition of RCRA hazardous waste, doesn't mean that you're not regulated. You can dispose of it anyway. And then, of course, you have your remediation regulations that all of you are incredibly familiar with. All right, some important concepts I wanted to bring out. The first one is point of generation. The way RCRA works is your waste is regulated from the cradle to grave. So that cradle is the point of generation. And one of the important concepts with remediation waste is what is a listed waste versus what a characteristic waste is. Let me see a show of hands for people that feel really confident about that. Characteristic versus listed. Okay, not too bad. All right. So your characteristic waste is waste that through some test, usually TCLP or pH, or there's something intrinsically about the waste that makes it hazardous. Listed wastes are wastes that are hazardous waste not because they failed a certain test, but because they come from a certain process, let's say cyanide plating bath. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about contained in policy for contaminated environmental media, area of contamination, and requirements for treatment, which will include landfill disposal restrictions. So the first, as I mentioned, is the point of generation. So as a general principle, when a waste is placed into storage or disposal prior to the effective date of RCRA, it's not a waste until it's removed. So in the case of contaminated soil that's buried, even if that soil flunks characteristic, if that material was buried prior to the effective date of RCRA in 1980, it's not a hazardous waste yet. It doesn't fall into RCRA jurisdiction yet. It falls into RCRA jurisdiction when you dig it up. So as long as it's in the ground. Now, once it's removed from the ground, that's the point at which it was generated. So we treat the removal of the waste from the ground just like we would treat a factory that just generated a waste. At that point, when you pump it out, when you dig it up, when you take it out of the ground, now it becomes a waste. And there are some special situations that deal with environmental media, like soils and sediments that have been contaminated. The nature of RCRA is that it is, I always like to say, surplus Old Testament. We hold the son responsible for the sins of the father. RCRA does not. RCRA is not retroactive. So if a waste was generated prior to November 19th, 1980, RCRA does not apply until you, say, dig up the material. So at the point of generation is when you have to comply with RCRA. Now, a very important concept in RCRA is hazardous waste determination. And a generator of hazardous waste, and if the owner digs up that waste, he becomes a generator. The generator is ultimately and solely responsible for characterizing his or her waste. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is often you will hear it was based on an opinion from a consultant, from a transporter, from a facility, from even a state regulatory agency. Cannot relieve you of that burden. You as a property owner always have the burden of hazardous waste determination. Every waste that you generate, you have to make that determination as to whether or not it's a hazardous waste. Compliance begins at the point and time of generation, not when the tests come back. So, in theory, you have generated the waste as soon as you dug it up, even though you haven't got the test results back. So there is also a concept of cogeneration. You may have an operation. You're not the owner of the property, but you're doing some operation at the property. Both you and the owner become co-generators. May also be a remediation contractor at a property that doesn't own it. You may become a co-generator. Means you can sign a manifest, and therefore you get all the liability that comes along with that. Isn't that fun? So I want to talk a little bit about listed versus characteristic waste. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So characteristic waste is hazardous by virtue of some property of the waste. Ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, it reacts with water, say, or toxicity. Toxicity, that's one you're most familiar with, right? You found TCLP for lead or for VOCs. And contaminated environmental media, if it's contaminated to a point that it exhibits that same characteristic, then it is hazardous. So if you had, say, lead-containing waste that then contaminated environmental media to the point that the environmental media flunked TCLP for lead, then that environmental media could be a hazardous waste. And media, as I said, is soil, groundwater, or sediment. Now, with listed waste, it meets the definition of listing. So it's how it was generated. Say a spent solvent, metal finishing waste, commercial chemical products that are unused. And there are state specific. Certain states may have their own listed hazardous waste. The thing about the listing that makes it significant is because, first of all, there's no test that determines something is an F001 waste. The characteristic waste have a D code on the manifest. The listed waste have F, P, or U code. There's no test to determine whether or not it is a listed hazardous waste. But the most important thing about listed hazardous waste is once you generate a listed waste, in theory, let's say a spent solvent, TCE. In theory, every molecule of that is regulated. So if a small amount were to spill from a TCE drum, there's any TCE in whatever it spills into, that is all hazardous waste. In theory, regardless of what the concentration is. However, we do get into the contained in principles. So contaminated environmental media that contains a listed hazardous waste is regulated as listed waste, as I just mentioned. A lot of times with listed hazardous waste, the question comes up, let's say you had a TCE at a site. You don't know where the contamination was from. So a lot of people, I used to be guilty of this myself, our agency used to tell people, if the company operated from 1950 until 1995 and it released TCE, is it a listed hazardous waste? I have TCE in the soil. Is it a listed? How many people think it's listed? How many people think it's not listed? Okay. Could be either, but the rule is, the federal rule, and most of the northeastern states go along with this, is that if after a good faith effort you can't figure, and this is often the case, you can't figure out, there's TCE released, you don't know when it was, whether it was 1950 or 1994. You have to research it. And after a good faith effort to determine when the waste was released, you still can't tell, then it's not a listed hazardous waste, which is very important to remember because that can impact your disposal costs significantly. So you have to know how it happened and when it happened. So if it's inconclusive, it's not necessarily hazardous waste. Do you have to prove beyond all reasonable doubt? No. You just have to be able to show whether or not, with reason to believe, that that waste was released after 1980, or whenever the listing of that material came into effect. Most of it's 1980. So what is documentation? You could document it with manifests, inspection reports, company records, town records, former employees. Really, the good faith effort requires that you make every effort reasonable to figure out how that waste was released. So, the contained in policy, I said that in theory, every molecule of that TCE, once it gets released to the river, then in theory that entire river is listed waste. We all know that's not realistic. So the contained in policy is an attempt to be realistic. And all the NEWMOA states have recognized this contained in policy. So if the contamination occurred, and this is where I'm going back, I'm sorry if I keep going back to 1980 like it's this incredibly significant world altering event, but it actually is in the RCRA world. So if your contamination of, say, your media occurred prior to 1980, then it was never a listed waste. The contained in determination is not strictly relevant. If it happened after the generation, was a hazardous waste up until the determination was completed. And this is important for land disposal restrictions as well. And some states may require a formal approval of a contained in determination prior to disposal. So the point about the, I'll get into it later. Area of contamination is another important concept in remediation. Now in theory, like you see in this slide, you have a contaminated soil pile and it's all contiguous. So you know if a waste, where's my pointer not working? There it is. This is an EPA policy, but the New England states, Northeast states all follow it. The area of contamination is a single contiguous area of contamination. The reason why this is significant is because you can move waste around within an area of contamination without triggering the RCRA requirements. Now, in our diagram, it's one continuous soil pile is contaminated, and then outside of that soil pile, everything is actually clean. And we all know that doesn't really happen in the world, but it's important to define what your area of contamination is, because you can move, you can transport waste within that area of contamination without running afoul of any RCRA rules. So let's say you had a road running through this soil pile. The road itself doesn't have the, we'll stick with TCE contamination. The road isn't contaminated, but there's a pile on the west side of the road. There's soil on the west side of the road and soil on the east side of the road. Is it all within the same area of contamination? Well, if you dug up the road or you bored beneath the road and you found there was contaminated soil underneath the road, then you do have an area of contamination, continuous area of contamination that's crossed by a road. So we all know in the real world what happens is often contamination from different sources interfingers and mixes, and you may get clean samples in between two areas. Doesn't mean that those two piles are not contiguous. So you can do consolidation within an area of contamination. You can do in situ treatment, and you're not required to get a RCRA permit. What doesn't it cover? Once you move the waste outside of the area of contamination, you're now transporting the RCRA. Similarly, if you move between two different areas of contamination, then you run into the RCRA requirements for how waste can be moved. So again, I wanted to emphasize that when you define your area of contamination, make sure you take into account that contaminant zones can intermix and interfinger with each other. And ex situ treatment is obviously not covered under that exemption. Okay, so the requirements for treatment of contaminated environmental media. As a general rule, treatment of hazardous waste requires a RCRA permit. Anybody know too much about the process of getting a RCRA permit for a treatment and storage disposal facility? You submit an application, you also need to submit psychiatric evaluation, because it is a multi-million-dollar, multi-decade-long procedure to get a brand new RCRA facility permit. I can't even remember. I've been in 30 years. I can't remember what the last new RCRA facility I saw in New England was. But there are exceptions that don't require you to get a permit. Okay. So the first is, as I mentioned, in theory, we regulate the listed waste down to every molecule, but in reality, we allow what's called a contained out determination. There is treatment in accordance with in the area of contamination, where we always said you haven't generated it yet. We're still dealing with it within that area of contamination. Why the area of contamination is so important. Generators can also do things like treat in tanks and containers and treat in wastewater treatment units under certain circumstances. And they can also get authorization under RCRA corrective action. You can get authorization to be a treatment unit or CAMU, corrective action management unit. This is the RCRA corrective action version of giving you a permit without making you go through a permit process. Now, of course, just because it's not regulated federally under RCRA doesn't mean you might not require some permit in your state. So let's say mobile soil treatment. Air and water permits may also be required, like for soil venting, groundwater pump and treat. I'm going to cover landfill disposal restrictions very quickly. They can be incredibly complicated. The purpose is to ensure safe disposal of hazardous waste and residuals from the treatment of hazardous waste. And at the point of generation, the land disposal restrictions apply and continue to apply until it's either treated and rendered non-hazardous or disposed of as hazardous waste. Hazardous waste may not be placed on land unless it meets the applicable LDR standards. So the importance of this is you're generating a soil that may meet the standard for hazardous waste. You need to containerize it appropriately. So the standards for landfill disposal requirement requires treatment to certain standards. Sometimes they're treatment to a certain concentration, and sometimes they're treatment using a certain technology. And I mentioned before about the contained in policy. If a waste is generated before it is contained out, the LDRs do apply. Okay, alternative treatment standards for certain kinds of waste. There are contaminated soil is one of those wastes that has its own special treatment standard in 40 CFR, and it's 90% reduction in contaminant concentrations and cannot exceed 10 times the universal treatment standard. This is something that you'll find in RCRA. It's chemical specific. For hazardous debris, okay, I won't go into too much detail on those. Okay, so of course, just to mention, because we are in the Northeast, even if the contaminated soil or sediment is not a hazardous waste, that doesn't mean it's not regulated by your state. In our state, we regulate a lot of contaminated materials as solid waste if they don't fail RCRA characteristic. Some states like mine will call certain waste, like I mentioned, asbestos-containing waste, is a special solid waste that can only be disposed of at a landfill that's permitted to accept it. So, examples of facilities that may require a permit: landfills, soil burning facilities. The state remediation standards may also apply. Use of fill may be restricted like in Rhode Island. Industrial, if it meets industrial commercial standards, has to have an environmental land use restriction on it. Okay, and NEWMOA webpage has some state-specific information on that. I wanted to give us a real-world example of this issue of determination of listing. This is from a plating facility in Rhode Island, Regal plating, and this was a TCE plume. This is an example of what I wanted to talk about when I was saying a good faith effort to figure out whether or not the waste was listed. You look up at the top of that diagram, you'll see that PCBs, there's a PCB transformer that was formerly located. You'll see up here, outside of the area of contamination, a former TCE above ground storage tank. And then you'll see right in the center of that plume was where the TCE, right here, by the pointer die, there it is. Okay, so if you look right in the center there, that's the TCE degreasing area. So this is an operation that changed over time. They had different materials stored, they have different processes. They interviewed people that worked at the companies. They looked at records for how the company operated. And in this case, you see if you look up in the upper left there, the former TCE above ground storage tank, obviously that wasn't the source of release. When we look at the plume, we see the plume coming from the degreasing operation. So when you have the site-specific data, you can start to hone in on, well, when was that area used versus when were these tanks used? And in this case, they did make the determination that there was a release of TCE and cyanide that occurred after 1980. So it was considered to be a listed hazardous waste. So they determined that there was a release of listed waste. The impacted soils were divided into two categories, and one was a soil that flunked TCLP for, trying to remember, I think it failed for cyanide, and that had to be disposed of as a hazardous waste. But they had a larger volume of moderately impacted soils that were below TCLP. They were above a leachability standard and a residential standard, but they were below the leachability standard for GB aquifers, which this is a GB aquifer, and they were below industrial commercial standards. So the importance of this is, I made a little reference to the contained out policy that a state can make, and this usually has to be in, I think in all the states in our region, it has to be in writing, that you ask the state for permission, even though it's contaminated environmental media that had a listed hazardous waste, if it's below the applicable remediation standard for that material, be it groundwater or soils, in this case soils, the state can issue a contained out determination saying that that is no longer a listed hazardous waste. But this is something that needs to be done in writing from the state. So in this case, they asked the state for a contained out determination. We provided one, and this waste could be disposed of at a licensed solid waste facility. Why? Because in terms of what's the applicable environmental standard, if it met residential criteria, we'd say it can go anywhere, but it didn't. It met industrial commercial criteria. So a lined landfill would be an example of a site where that material is allowed. Some other examples that I wanted to provide, soil is excavated and placed outside of an area of contamination, but it's not discovered to be hazardous until sampling results come back. This is fairly common, right? Usually, if you have any idea that it could be a hazardous waste, you want to containerize it until you get your analysis back. And by containerize it, I mean it may be as simple as putting a liner down over the soil. Soil with a listed solvent, excavated and placed in roll-offs. And this is an example like what I gave, where you had a contained out determination from the state and it can be treated as a solid waste or left in place. Wood block flooring was not discovered to be contaminated with a listed solvent until it was removed and staged in outdoor piles. And this is another example of something that didn't seem like it was hazardous waste, but in accordance with the rules, really, if you're not sure, you should be cautious, treat it as a hazardous waste, containerize it in some way until you get your results back. So it's tempting to focus on the cleanup and worry about the characterization of the waste later. We all tend to do that, but the law of unintended consequences can kick in, subjecting, obviously, you have enforcement actions, need for approvals and permits that you didn't recognize beforehand, delays, cost overruns. So opportunities to minimize those costs can be missed. The timing of these determinations can be important. And if you need a contained out determination from the state, you need to allow that you're going to have that determination, and your need to store and stage those piles needs to meet those time frames. In situ versus ex situ treatment, different regulatory requirements here. So what I'd like to say is if you think you might be applicable, think about, just like a lot of other areas of your characterization, you need to think about the RCRA regulations and how they might tie into your site prior to doing any work at the site. And I want to mention, we are considering some future presentations on some of these specific areas of RCRA. We obviously look for your input. So how are we doing on time?
We got a lot of time.
We got a lot of time. Oh, great.
So, all right. Well, first, thank you, Mark.
Okay.
And then I definitely have some questions, but people in the audience have some questions. Repeat the question.
The question was, are you not allowed to treat waste in situ within the area of contamination? If I said that, I didn't mean to say that. What I meant to say is that you are covered by that exemption within the area of contamination. But if you take your waste from one area of contamination to another area of contamination, then RCRA requirements will kick in. Also, I should mention, let's say a groundwater treatment that you've never, you may do a treatment in situ where you didn't dig up the material. So you didn't ever generate the material.
Okay. So I'm wondering about rules of thumb to tell these folks so that they don't get into trouble. So you want to try to characterize your soil while it's still in the ground to determine whether there's a possible problem when you dig it up, because you want to know ahead of time about it. And you don't, if you dig it up, you don't want to move it very far because that could get you into trouble. You want to keep it pretty close to where it is until you figure all this out. Or like, what are the rules of thumb so people don't get into trouble?
I think the biggest rule of thumb is don't remove it from the area of contamination until you've actually made a determination that it is not a hazardous waste. So bear in mind that as soon as you generate the waste, you are required to make a determination. Now, you're doing a test pit, you're digging it up, you're testing it, putting it right back in. You haven't, most states, I think all of them, you haven't generated it at that point. You haven't taken it out of the area of contamination. You're just testing. But I would start thinking early on about whether or not you meet the RCRA requirements, and then you can decide whether or not you need to keep the waste within the area of contamination until your sampling results come back.
Okay, and I think yesterday when Ross Bunnell from Connecticut, those case studies are right at the end, he mentioned the wood block flooring, and what ended up happening was in the manufacturing facility, there was like a solvent tank, and it was just in one area, and it had really, really contaminated those blocks. But then when they dug everything up, they didn't test beforehand. Like if they had tested beforehand and could just isolate those blocks, but what they did was dig everything up and run it through a chipper, and then test the pile afterwards. And then they ended up with a huge quantity of hazardous material rather than they had just paid attention before they did everything. They would have had a much smaller quantity that they had to deal with. So I guess that's another lesson. Just keep all this in mind.
Yeah, thank you. So dilution is not the solution to pollution with RCRA. Dilution is the solution to having too much money. So, because if I take 1 pound of hazardous waste, whether it's listed or whether it's characteristic, say I have material that flunks CCLP for lead, so 10 parts per million. If I take that 1 pound of soil and mix it with 100 tons of uncontaminated soil, I have 100 tons of RCRA hazardous waste. Yes?
It applied to multiple phases. For instance, a waste oil tank, which has got filled in with water rather than unregistered. You've got a sludge maybe characteristic. Also has water in it. All the water in the oil considered hazardous if the sludge fails?
So the question is, you have an oil tank, and you have a sludge at the bottom of the oil tank, and the sludge is hazardous, and the water at the top of the oil tank is not hazardous.
Well, that's my question.
Or the water, listen, the water on the top of the tank didn't fail a test. You can test them separately, yes. And and this can sometimes be a judgment call, but clearly you have two separate phases, two separate materials that you're sampling. You as a generator have to characterize all the waste that you generate. So if you generate a liquid water, which may have some more contamination, and you generate the sludge, then you can characterize them separately. But if you take a sludge from that tank and mix it with sludge from other tanks, and one of the sludges in one of those tanks was hazardous, then all of the sludges are now hazardous by virtue of you mixing them, because you did that after 1980. Yes? the question is whether the in situ treatment and ex situ treatment, when we use that term, whether it all has to be below grade or whether it can be above the ground. Certainly if it's below grade, that's in situ. If it is above the ground, is it outside the area of contamination? Within the area of contamination, you can do treatment without being a RCRA facility, but once you've left the area of contamination, then you are in our world. There's a vertical and a horizontal dimension. That's one way to look at it. Yes. The comment is that often equipment operators don't always understand what the RCRA rules and regulations are, and that they often may inadvertently or unknowingly or without really caring mix contaminated material and uncontaminated material. That's a problem. And that's a problem also because to be a generator in RCRA, you have to be the owner or the operator, the person that causes the material to be generated. You can be co-generator. So even though you're not with the excavating company is operating on your property, or the excavating company was subcontracted by you, and therefore you are the generator. So you don't have to mean to do it in RCRA to be regulated. So it's an important concept to keep in mind. Does the operator become a co-generator? It depends. It depends on the nature of you as the owner. Any agents that work for you are generating, at least you are a co-generator. And in some circumstances, your agents are simply like your employees. In other circumstances, there will be agents that work for you and are co-generators and may generate that waste under their own EPID number, say. They may actually list themselves as being generators, but you never get out of it. If you hired them, you're on the hook. And when you apply for a generator number, the owner has to sign off on that application.
Other questions? So the contained in, contained out thing always confuses me, but it sounded like states are pretty flexible about the contained out. If you do approach them for a determination, they're not unreasonable, but the key is to actually go through the process in a timely fashion.
Right.
Am I summarizing that correctly?
Yeah. And for the contained out determination, there are even now a lot of states that will say, even though it's not a listed hazardous waste, our facility requires a contained out determination. And as time goes on, I get more and more of those requests. Even though it technically isn't listed, we still want you to go through the process of saying, we agree that it's below a certain remediation standard and that it can be, say, landfilled.
Okay. The slides will be up on the website for future reference as well. Any other questions? Oh, and yeah, the future NEWMOA training. They're planning, I think, webinars in the fall, probably, every couple weeks there would be one, and these are the topics that they're thinking of. But if you guys have specific questions or things that you think would be helpful for the webinars to address, you could write that on your evaluation form or come talk to Mark or myself, and we can relay that feedback back to the group. But we realize it's kind of confusing, and I'm confused. And there's Mark's information.
So if you're confused, there's my information.
So, thank you again, Mark.